I'm going to do a couple of lectures on what I call the commercial types of the 19th century. The reason for the word commercial sort of explains itself when you open a type specimen and you find this statement being used for the wording. Well, we'll look why that was quite soon. The reaction from the more conservative part of the printing trade was predictable. Hansard, who wrote a very good handbook of the trade, didn't like a new version of Old English. Antique, modern antique. What was that? As for English Italian, well, we'll look at that too. The paradox is that these new types, in a sense, grew out of this rather austere movement back to the neoclassical mode of architecture at the end of the 18th century. This fantastic idea of a monument to the world scientist Isaac Newton, who had decoded the universe, is both the idea of a perfect sphere, a geometrical form, but of course it's also a deliberate reference to a real monument of ancient Rome, the Mausoleum of Hadrian, now known as the Castel Sant'Angelo. The scale is crazy. Those are real human figures at the bottom. And the monument is fringed with cypress trees. But it's a fantasy. It didn't get built. On the other hand, the idea of a primitive form as the basis for real building was explained in the work of William Chambers, who built Somerset House in London. In his treatise on what he calls civil architecture, he shows how the columns and the other parts of a classical building can be traced back to a crude wooden structure. This isn't a program for a real building. And yet, during the long state of warfare between England and France, English antiquarians, archaeologists, were more or less forced to take seriously some of the primitive buildings that existed in Britain. And Blake, of course, used the concept of the trilithon of Stonehenge in this fantasy that accompanies one of his poems. The scale of that fantasy Stonehenge, like the monument to Newton, is of course quite crazy. That's the real scale of Stonehenge. But it has another appeal. It's not just the size. It is simple. And one of the simplest forms of alphabet is, of course, the sans serif. William Caslon, of all people, did make what was known as an Etruscan type. Clearly, it's one of the primitive forms of the Roman letter. But as used by the Etruscans, that other ethnic group that were more or less ethnically cleansed from the peninsula of Italy, their inscriptions do survive, but their language is still not really decoded. On the other hand, for printing the inscriptions, it was felt useful to have a real Etruscan type. There's your sans serif, monoline letter. This idea of the appeal of the simple forms at the end of the 18th century was well caught by a very, very gifted scholar, Georg Kurt Schauer. I'm not going to attempt to translate this article that he did in 1960, but I will pull out just one phrase. Talking of these, what he called linear kinds of letter, he very acutely suggested that its very primitivism was an appeal at that period. And that's really the theme that I'm going to explore now. Greek architecture was rediscovered in the late 18th century, first of all as something quite crude, and then also as a model for copying. There are many neo-Greek buildings in the late 18th century. Notice how the Greek Doric column it's a thick column, and it comes down onto the stone below without any kind of frills or mouldings. It's a kind of prototype sans serif in architectural terms. Piranesi, who's famous for his etchings of the buildings of ancient Rome, rather to my surprise, experimented with a monoline sans serif letter. Here it is as a detail of his book on Roman antiquities, Le Antiquità Romane. Extraordinary letter. Was he fascinated by the sans serif? No, is the answer, I'm afraid. It's the only thing of its kind in his entire work. And this will make an exception for a really rather extraordinary initial letter, which he designed. Again, could you extend this idea into other letters? Well, I suppose you could, but Piranesi didn't. But here, again, about the same date, you have an extraordinary architectural sans serif. So, to my mind, the Roman antiquity that started the whole new form of letter going is this little round temple not far from Rome at Tivoli. It's got an inscription on it. It belongs to the Republican period, when monoline sans serifs were normal for inscriptions. If you want to take a photograph of the inscription, which is in the fragment you can just about see from where we are taking this photograph, there it is. But as you can imagine, you don't step back where there's a rather steep drop behind you. But there it is. I say it's a sans serif. It isn't quite. There are serifs there, but they're really not very obtrusive. And that name, Gelio, is pretty geometrical. This is the way it looked to the English architect George Dance, who made this drawing of it in the 1760s. Totally monoline, and as I say, the serifs are there, but they're really not obtrusive. And the letter O, of course, is pure geometry. You can see where the compass point went in. Well, this was, of course, the origin for my own researches into the sans serif. So excuse me if I simply put this in front of you, but the rest of the story is in the book we did for an exhibition at the Soane Museum. Why Soane? Well, he was the pupil of George Dance. And he became obsessed with the little round temple at Tivoli, and even built a version of it into one corner of the Bank of England. More seriously, when he was in Rome, he made this design as a prize drawing for the Royal Academy, and in a sense invented the sans serif. It's the earliest known example of a monoline sans serif in his work, and it was to become a kind of theme that he would go on exploring. Here, for example, he was given the job of converting Norwich Castle into the county jail, and there's the letter he thought was appropriate to put on the front of it. And there is the caption to the drawing in 1789. And once again, the geometrical qualities are there. Notice the compass point with which he's enabled him to do a perfect O. And this is an inscription he would have put on that new building for the Bank of England. It never seems to have got there, but he clearly intended it to. Perhaps the client was less than cooperative. Another job he nearly got was rebuilding the House of Lords. It never actually got built, but the sans serif he drew to identify it is an extraordinary thing. I mean, to my mind, this could well have been done in 1930 rather than 1794. Well, Soane is a kind of pioneer here. Let's look at another figure of the same period. Brooke Boothby was a country landowner in Derbyshire, and there's a painting of him by Joseph Wright, Wright of Derby, in what I suppose is a fairly informal kind of dress, beautifully made suit. The book he's treating so badly is an edition of the works of Rousseau, who actually visited him in Derbyshire. His life was, in a way, ruined by the death of his little daughter. And yet, in a way, it enabled him to take the opportunity to make, or have made, a most elegant neoclassical monument, which is in the parish church in Ashbourne. And I don't have to point out that the inscription, or the many inscriptions, it's absolutely covered with them, is a sans serif. We don't know if there's any kind of influence by Soane here, or maybe this is simply one of the themes that was widely felt. So here is the one view of the monument. All the sayings are from rather gloomy kinds of sepulchral words. That's from the book of Job. This, or these two inscriptions, both come from La Nouvelle Héloïse, the novel by Rousseau. Beauté, c'est donc ici ton dernier asile. Well, it's a sepulchral phrase. So sans serif was, you might say, a theme that was in the air. And round about 1816, or maybe a little before, a London type founder put this type into his specimen, calling it Egyptian. Why did he put it there? Was it the idea of some client like Boothby? We really have no idea. It's never been found in use at this date, but there it is. And of course, it is an extraordinarily basic, primitive form of letter compared with the decorative ones either side of it. Pure geometry. In fact, although it got called Egyptian, this letter was really identified with early Roman work, the Roman Republican monoline letter. And if you look at an Ordnance Survey 1-inch map, this one must have been drawn about 1920, the Roman road is identified with what they thought was an Egyptian letter, but seemed appropriate for Roman antiquities, just as the later Wansdyke is put in English Gothic. Here's the theme of the Roman letter. This is a magazine discussing the new forms of signwriters' letters that were rather startling people in London. They are old Roman letters, or so the writer here calls them, and he shows what he means. It is a monoline sans serif, of course. And this idea that the sans serif was an old Roman letter is perpetuated in, for example, this rather weird fantasy of that you could build a pyramid on the downs behind Portsmouth and put the inscription on this Egyptian monument in old Roman letters. Well, it never happened. But the same letters, you can see, were used on this medal commemorating the battle that took place in 1806, with the figure of Britannia and a sans serif inscription. Let's move to Roman. We've looked at the Fry version of John Baskerville's type, and this is certainly a most elegant letter produced in the 1760s. Somehow it didn't seem quite vigorous enough. It's a most elegant piece of calligraphic letter drawing, but faced with the cruder versions of letters that were becoming used, perhaps it needed a little bit of more emphasis. Well, that's quite emphatic. The so-called fat face. Fat, by the way, is the term for which we would use bold in typographical terms. Well, that was a bit crude. Here is the Figgins Foundry doing, frankly, a rather more elegant version of that letter, but it's still fairly hefty. And here is one of Figgins's slightly smaller letters, it's about a 48 point, but still with this vigorous contrast between thick and thin. And I suppose you could say that that symbol is sort of typical or emblematic of the context in which it would be used. And of course, equally bold but marvellously drawn figures to go with it too. Here, staying with the Figgins Foundry, you have some really big letters. And what is that £30 doing there? Well, as I'm suggesting, there wasn't room to get all the other zeros in, but £30,000 had a real meaning. This is how big that letter is. 2.5 inches, 190 point. No one had ever made type on quite that scale before. And here's why it was made. The idea of the poster was just developing. And in this case, the lottery, the state lottery in 1807, is offering these staggering prizes, of which £30,000, clearly millions in modern money, is the main prize to be won. The lottery was operated by commercial agents who sold tickets on a commission. And Bish was one of the most enterprising of the agents. Here's a little handbill that he would give out in the street. Open up a type specimen. And whose name do you find being used for one of the fatter of the fat faces? This bold type, which at its best, as you've seen, is very, very finely drawn, is something that I was able to use when faced with some rather awful lettering put at the stern of HMS Victory, which is still preserved at Portsmouth. But as you see from this image, it did actually have a rather fine and large Roman lettering across the stern when it was brought back from Trafalgar. And so we were able to persuade the Admiralty that really it was time that the lettering was put back to what it should have been. And in 2015, we managed to get that fat face, or a version of it, put onto Victory where it belongs. It doesn't have to be a Roman letter. The slab serif, which got called antique for reasons I've never quite worked out, was used to urge people to buy lottery tickets. That's what win sums clearly means here. And the slab serif, the antique, became one of the great themes of 19th century typography. Except that one founder, called Thorne, preferred to take the word Egyptian. So sometimes the slab serif does have this name Egyptian. But there we are. It's a good form of letter for getting a message across forcefully. And here are some of Thorne's Egyptians. We don't know when they were first made as type, but here you have one of the lottery agents' handbills of 1810, and that's long before any slab serif type was made. So this is clearly a couple of wood engravings are using this new form of letter. And we still don't know the complete history of it. But lotteries were they were big money and attracted a lot of attention. So if you look at this agent's ticket, it uses, in 1807, again long before any type of the kind was made, a sans serif to grab attention with the novelty of its form. But I suppose it is the fat-faced Roman and italic and the slab serif that form the theme of basic posters to attract attention. This is a poster, a big poster that will grab your attention, advertising tickets on a steam packet, which will start from the Tower of London and take you down the Thames. We saw an Italian type as something that drew the fire of Hansard among the typographic monstrosities. It's a complete paradox. Every thin stroke is thick and the other way round. But again, you have to hand it to the maker to have handled this absurd idea with extreme ingenuity, let's say. Why Italian? Simply the idea that foreigners do things in an odd way. So there once again is the paradox, the modern antique, the English Italian, and so on. The sans serif remains the essential stripped down form of letter that really had no precedent in typography, except for that Etruscan. Here is Figgins, giving you a little bit of thick and thin in the place of the pure geometry of the Caslon Egyptian, but it's a startling letter all the same. Sans serif is what he called it, and so do we. Except, and we're now moving into the 19th century, the Thorogood foundry made a type that was so weird that the founder himself called it grotesque, another name that has kind of stuck. It's new and leads us into the new century in two interesting directions. The capital letters are condensed, not a pure geometry anymore, but if you want to pack a lot of letters into a poster, playing with the proportions does help. And of course it has a lowercase. And that really is leading us into a whole new typographical world. Let's take our leave of the Caslon Egyptian, just because it is so very basic and essential in its forms. Pure geometry. Remind one of something? Well, of course it does. If the Caslon letter is in a specimen of 1816, this is what was to come in 1916. And so we'll leave this lecture with the two paired together are not really so very different in their forms.